Our first panel is a panel that's called At Water's Edge. This morning we are really lucky to have a wonderful panel with amazing folks on it, and our host is longtime host of RadioWest. I'm sure a lot of you know that show, and he's often referred to by humorist and author David Sedaris as the best looking man in radio. Welcome, Doug Fabrizio.
Thank you very much. Welcome. Of course, Great Salt Lake isn't the only terminal lake that is or has faced a crisis caused by environmental conditions and the imperatives of growth and development in the way we humans conduct our lives. In fact, to find some models for what can happen here, the bad stuff, and maybe the solutions, you don't have to go far. There are two pretty decent models of saline lake systems in California, Owens Lake and Mono Lake. Not so long ago, a group of reporters traveled there to explore what happened and what kind of lessons can be drawn from residents there and policy leaders and activists. These reporters are part of the Great Salt Lake Collaborative. For those not familiar, it's a group of news and education and media organizations who have been looking for stories and models and solutions to the crisis that is facing Great Salt Lake. And they are here today to talk a little bit about this project, to talk about this journey they took not so long ago, the lessons and the questions that they came back with. Do those stories translate to this place? Are the conditions the same? Are they drastically different? Is this a political question? Is this a cultural question? Is this social? Let me introduce Leia Larsen with the Salt Lake Tribune. Leia, welcome to you. Thanks for being with us. Amy Joy Donahue, of course, with the Deseret News, also with us. Spencer Heaps was part of the project. He's the Deputy Director of Photography for the Deseret News in Salt Lake City. He's on assignment, couldn't join us today, but Manuel Rodriguez, who was also part of the project, the videographer and photographer for Fox 13 News, is with us. Manuel, welcome to you. Let's begin with a video that you've compiled. We'll start there. That'll set some groundwork for the conversation.
The Great Salt Lake is on the brink of collapse. It's the story of many terminal lakes around the world, desiccated from a warming climate and water consumption that's out of balance. But Utahns don't need to look far to see why the Great Salt Lake is worth fighting for and what they stand to lose if it turns to dust. Owens Lake, 250 miles north of Los Angeles, has already been through what the Great Salt Lake is now facing. Our multimedia reporting showed the worst-case scenario of a dried-up valley, loss of bird habitat and food, and nearby communities choking on dust. We also showed the work being done to mitigate dust plumes at a cost of $2.5 billion to the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. Phil Kiddu has spent 17 years watching Owens Lake transform from an environmental disaster to a place where the birds have returned and the air is finally clear.
You know, the success of the project it actually truly is incredible. You know, to take the largest source in the entire nation, control it, you know, through mechanisms that were developed and studied here at Owens Lake. And then, you know, the cost, which, you know, you put the total price tag at, say, $2.5 billion, which just sounds atrocious and absurd. Pound for pound of emission reductions, it's the cheapest dust control project for fugitive emissions in the entire country.
13 miles east of Yosemite National Park, near Lee Vining, California, lies Mono Lake, a virtual twin to the Great Salt Lake. Both have trillions of brine shrimp, islands for migrating birds, and both are tourist attractions. The public saw where Mono Lake was headed, and a grassroots committee saved it under the public trust doctrine, arguing the state had the duty to protect it. In 1983, the California Supreme Court ruled in Mono Lake's favor. It's a case legal scholars lauded, with some proclaiming it revolutionized Western water law. Despite the California State Water Resources Control Board mandating lake rise in the mid-1990s, Mono has yet to hit its ideal level. What does that bode for Great Salt Lake?
There's a legacy of those excessive diversions that, even though it's not happening today and it wasn't happening yesterday, carries on.
Great Salt Lake. Back at home, it is becoming clear that we can't mitigate what we can't measure. If the Great Salt Lake turns to dust, the pollution can be controlled, but it's going to be exorbitantly expensive. Owens Lake is a fraction of the Great Salt Lake size. The Great Salt Lake Collaborative also needs to move into the community with events and other awareness-raising endeavors. So please consider supporting the collaborative with a contribution today at greatsaltlakenews.org.
We're not just going to hear from the reporters on this project. Of course, we have other panelists. Let me introduce them, because they're going to be trying to address some of the questions that came from the journey that you took. Joel Ferry is with us. Joel is the new head of Utah's Department of Natural Resources. And Joel Ferry, welcome to you. Thanks very much for being with us. Laura Briefer, also with us, director of Salt Lake City's Department of Public Utilities. Welcome to you. Thanks for being with us. We have Steve Clyde with us as well. He's a water attorney who's been involved in writing some of the strategies on how to get water to Great Salt Lake. And Steve Clyde, welcome to you. I want to start with the reporters, though. Amy Joy and Leia, talk a little bit about why you went to California. I mean, you say in your reporting that you wanted to focus on the potential future of the lake, not the conflicts that were there in California, but the conflicts did give you some guidance. Talk about what you were looking for when you went there.
Well, I think like a lot of us had heard about Owens Lake. I'd written about it a little bit, but I'd never been there. So I was just curious as to what they did with this, largest human-caused source of pollution in the U.S. How did they get that under control? And on top of that, the communities living around this lake, why did they stay? So I really wanted to go out there for that. And then for Mono Lake, I was really interested in what was so special about this lake that the community organized to save it, that a bunch of scrappy environmental groups and students got together to try and save this lake. And is there anything we can learn about what they did to apply at home?
And I think can you hear me? Okay. I think for me, I saw what had become of Owens Lake, and it concerned me about the Great Salt Lake. And so, again, like Leia, I wanted to learn about the dust control strategies that they had employed in that area, and if there's some proactive steps that we can take to avoid the disaster that that lake became. We had a lot to learn, and I think we did learn a lot on that trip from experts who'd spent years and billions of dollars mitigating these problems. And I think we're at the tip of that with the Great Salt Lake, with so much of the lake bed exposed right now. So we have an opportunity to act.
Manuel, you want to talk about your observations just broadly? We'll get into some specifics as we go, but give us your impressions.
My impressions were that it's a beautiful landscape out there, and it's unlike anything I've ever really seen. And I just really enjoyed learning and discussing, a lot of the issues that have been going on there for years. And I mean, I grew up in California and had no idea any of this even happened. And so it was a big learning experience even for me. And I just really wanted to go on this trip because I felt like it was something I kind of had to do and wanted to take on as far as being able to tell the story visually.
I want to pose kind of a broad question that I want to come back to after we dig into some of the details. But let me start with, you discovered and have written about a lot of similarities and parallels between Great Salt Lake and those saline systems in California. But do you think the experiences in California with those systems can translate to Utah. We have a different political landscape, we have a different culture. Does it translate in a way you thought it might? How are you thinking about that?
Well, I think some of the engineered solutions that they apply to Owens Lake certainly could be applied to the Great Salt Lake. I mean, we already are sort of applying engineered solutions. We're using the causeway to control salinity in the South Arm. So I think, you know, on a practical level, yeah.
The technical stuff,
yeah,
that translates, yeah.
But the politics, you know, could we apply the public trust doctrine to save the Great Salt Lake like they did at Mono Lake? I mean, Steve will probably speak to this, but that's kind of a gamble anytime you go to court, so yeah.
What do you think, Joy? Do they translate? Because we'll get to their answers in a minute.
Well, I think it translates in the differences. You know, I mean, there's some stark differences between Owens Lake and the main culprit who dried up the lake, and then our lake, which has so many straws in it. And so it translates in that we have a much bigger challenge here to face than even Owens Lake did at one point. So I think it's something that we all need to be keenly aware of, that it's going to take cooperation and political will to solve this problem on so many fronts, you know, from agriculture to lawmakers to the governor's office to water managers in the state, water districts. It's just a little bit mind-blowing because the breadth of our problem is so much more complex. So it translates, and it just kind of makes you go, oh, wow.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry.
go ahead. No.
I think to Amy's point, a theme that kept emerging at these two lakes is the thing they had working in their favor is there was one like deep-pocketed single entity to blame for all the issues, and you know, so it was easy to know who to target to get to pay to clean it all up and fix it all. But here, you know, we're all sort of responsible. So if we do go the way of Owens Lake, who's going to pay for the mitigation?
Joel Ferry, what do you make of that question? Does this translate?
It does on certain levels. I mean, they're not exactly parallel, but let me just start off by saying I really do appreciate the work that the collaborative is doing to bring these issues in a joint effort through different media outlets is absolutely incredible. I just never seen anything like that before, where we have this cooperative effort. When we look at the issues that are facing Great Salt Lake, I mean, the point has been brought up that there are thousands and thousands of straws, and every single one of us does have an impact. And but that also translates to every single one of us can make a difference, right? We can do things in our own individual lives and our own decision making that will make a difference. We're not separated from this problem; it's directly connected to us. And so I think that there's an empowerment that can come to the people of Utah to act together in a collaborative effort. We take this on together, and you know, there's not some bad guy, one single individual bad guy or boogeyman that we can point to. So what does that mean? It means that we are empowered and we can make a difference.
Laura Briefer?
Well, I kind of look at this from the perspective of a local government involved in water resource management. And municipalities and counties, we're kind of where the rubber hits the road. We're the ones that provide the water to each person's faucet. And one of the things that struck me with this series of excellent reporting is that, you know, we had a municipality, Los Angeles City, who was, you know, probably justifiably involved in trying to secure water resources for tremendous growth within that city, and taking it from places that are far away. And I think one of the things that really translates well for me right now is just the cautionary tale as a municipality to think upstream and downstream of where we're diverting water and where we're putting water back into the system. And really that we need to avoid disaster. You know, the cost of not doing anything, that cost of pollution and mitigation, and not to mention how those costs would probably disproportionately impact some of our most marginalized communities in terms of access to water and affordability and air pollution. I think these are all really important lessons for us. And like Joel, I think collective action is really necessary, and I'm hopeful for that. I'm very hopeful that we are getting in ahead of any disaster right now and really doing a lot of deep work on this.
Steve, Clay, what do you think? Are you, seems like, I don't want to, it would be oversimplifying it to say, hey, they fixed it in Owens Lake, and they figured it out in Mono. I mean, there are ongoing issues that they have to deal with. But does that translate? Do we have the same capacity to at least address it and deal with it in real ways as they did in California?
I think we do, but I don't think the public trust doctrine is the solution. Okay. And the reason for that is that with Mono Lake, for example, there was a single water user and a single water right owner. LA had purchased all of the riparian water rights that drained to Mono Lake. So it was pretty easy, excuse me, to target that single person. If we were to assert a public trust doctrine piece of litigation over Great Salt Lake, you would have to attack every diversionary water right on every tributary inflow to the lake, and that is thousands and thousands of individual water users, municipalities, large districts. It is just a very, very impractical solution. Our general stream adjudications that kind of take water rights on a stream or system-by-system basis take decades to complete. A public trust lawsuit against the entirety of the watershed would take 100 years. You just cannot practically do it.
So we're going to have to be creative. We're going to have to come up with
But there are, I think,
solutions.
creative ways to address it.
Yeah.
And we have, through the Governor's Water Strategy Report, to the House Joint Resolution, to the effort that has gone on with the Water Task Force and the Water Development Commission, we have a water banking statute in Utah. We have a split-season lease statute in Utah. We've modified the in-stream flow statute to get water to the lake and protect all those uses from forfeiture for non-use for their purposes for which the water was appropriated. Those are voluntary market-based transactions, but I think we will find willing takers as we move this process forward. Culturally, I think Utah is well adapted to this.
Well adapted to what?
Mutual water companies, for example, where we took a bunch of individual irrigators in rural communities and they aggregated their assets. They built a common ditch instead of everybody trying to run their own individuals, merged their water rights and priorities into these companies.
So what you're saying, there's a communal sensibility in the
Absolutely.
state that would make this possible.
And I think that same mentality still exists within the state, not with a lot of people, but with enough that I think by tapping into that and using these tools that have been legislatively created, we will find a solution. It's not going to be quick, but it will happen.
I see some of you nodding your heads and wanting to jump in. Don't wait for me to tell you to jump in. Just do if you want, so you know.
And forgive me, I love to preach.
Doug, let me just say I'm so, encouraged by Steve's comments there, because I couldn't agree more that the solution is not a court solution. The solution is a solution driven by free market principles and by the people of Utah. And that's really what we need to be focused on, I think.
Okay, so I don't want to keep straying too far away from the stories that you found. I want to come back to that. One of the questions you get at in the series is, what will this be like to live near a source of constant dust pollution? Talk about what you found in Lone Pine, California, for example. I wanted to get a sense of that. There was a man named Michael Prather who said, you can taste the salt in your throat. Do you want to just talk about what you found, what it's like to live with this constant threat?
Do you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
Well, I think like a lot of people, I had the impression that it must be terrible out there. There's this dead lake and all this dust pollution that's just constantly pounding these communities. But I think the people that live there sort of bristle at that, because what Michael told me is that, there's a couple days out of the year where the pollution gets really bad, so you stay inside and the kids don't go out to recess. And then it clears up, and you live in this beautiful mountain playground, and for that, it's worth it. And I immediately thought, like, wow, that sounds pretty familiar. You know, like, I think a lot of Utahns can probably relate to that. So it's not like they're constantly getting hit with dust storms. It's, you know, a couple of events out of the year, and nowadays they're not getting hit at all because they've controlled the dust to a large extent. But I think something that was interesting to me is that the lower income communities are probably getting hit harder. Like, there's a Paiute Shoshone reservation, and the feedback I got there is that a lot of the people and kids have asthma. There's a little community called Keeler that's right on what would have been the lake shoreline, and no matter which way the wind blows, they're just constantly getting hit with it. And so you can tell that's really economically crippled that town. Yeah, what did you?
Yeah, and I think Leia's right, because over the years, you know, the water district has done this tremendous amount of mitigation, and so the dust storms aren't as bad. But it doesn't mean that people still aren't exposed. And we see dust along the Wasatch Front all the time. There's been academic studies done that show that, you know, upwards of 40% of the dust in the northern Wasatch Front are coming from dry lake beds. And so we know the data is out there. You know, so how do we mitigate that? And I think a little bit of a difference I saw between, like, say, Mono Lake, Owens Lake, and Great Salt Lake is that we have a pretty stable crust on the exposed lake bed, and so it doesn't get whipped up by the winds as much as, like, these sand dunes that we were crawling up at Mono.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it was just like a lot of loose sand, but I still think there are strategies that could be employed by the state to be more active in monitoring dust from there in the dry, severe lake bed. So we have an idea, a better idea of exactly the source of dust. You know, I mean, you can blame Kennecott, you can blame the gravel pits, but, you know, what's the DNA of the dust? And I mean, you can be in Emery County driving along and it's been so dry, you see a dust storm out there. So there's a lot.
Did you guys get caught in a dust storm on the trip?
We did, but it was at Mono Lake, actually, which has eclipsed Owens Lake and is now Mono Lake is the largest source of dust pollution in the U.S. But luckily, the storms are downwind of the community that lives nearby, so they're not really human health impacts so far. But yeah, we saw one kick up, and it was like pretty crazy.
It was very noticeable, and like we were even just driving into the town, we were coming through like a mountain pass, and you could kind of see the dust blowing. And at first, I thought maybe it was fog or something, but then once it hit me, I realized it was just a lot of dust, and that was kind of like a big, kind of crazy realization that happened for me while we were out there.
Okay, so let's get to the question, some of the questions that came out of Owens Lake. One of them is, how much would that cost for us to devise these engineered solutions to keep the dust down here? And then, of course, who would pay for it? Joel Ferry, who would pay for it?
Well, ultimately, we would, right? All of us as citizens. I can tell you we've looked at this cost, and it was in the billions at Owens Lake, $3 billion, if I'm not mistaken, 3.1, 3.2. 2.5. Anyway,
just a couple of billions.
It was billions. It was billions. When you look at Great Salt Lake and the impacts there, you're talking a lake that's 15 times the size. So, a lot of the construction and the work that was done to impact on Owens was done when, decades, or, the last couple decades. And so when you factor in inflation, I mean, we're looking upwards of, 30, 40, 50 billion dollars to do something like this. And so you're talking significant cost. And when we look at the numbers, I'll tell you, we're actively, every day it's on the agenda, and this is something that we're actively working on a daily basis at the Department of Natural Resources. The cost to act today is so much more practical. To do conservation measures and to look at how can we be more efficient and how can we optimize our water use and how can we ensure water is getting down to the lake. Hydrology is playing a huge factor, though. We are in a decades-long drought, the worst drought in 1,200 years, and that plays a huge factor as well. But the combination of the diversion plus the drought has really exaggerated this problem today, but it would be expensive. But the cost to do conservation and efficiency projects today is the best investment we can make.
I think it's an interesting question to say that it would be expensive, as if this is something that would be way down the line there. But one of the questions that sort of came from the reporting project would be, can there be an engineered solution to keep the dust down now, at least until the lake rises again? Would that even be something that would be or should be considered? What do you all make of that?
There are thousands of acres. It would take a tremendous amount of effort to do it, but if
Is
you
anyone
look
even
at what it
talking
will
about
take
that or
to add
doing
the
that?
water to get there, we're also going to be decades. So I think this could be rolled out incrementally, and there probably are engineered solutions.
There are engineered solutions. The issue, though, that we're facing today, the imminent crisis, if you will, that's on the lake is some of those solutions would say, okay, let's berm off this area and flood it so that we don't have the dust, right? But what does that do to the main body of the lake? And so the issue that we're facing, the imminent crisis that we have today is actually the salinity. Salinity is rising very rapidly. We're actually over the point of a healthy ecosystem on the lake, and that's why we're pursuing immediate action to do things to mitigate that. So you have these diverging interests of, do we mitigate the dust? Do we mitigate the salinity? How do we manage that? And it's a really complex interaction that exists there, and one that's going to take some really tough decisions in the immediate future. One that we're actively working on, like I said, but we have to be mindful of every action has a reaction, and we have to model that and make sure that we understand what those reactions may be.
Well, I guess I also wanted to go back to that question of cost and whether it's, things that we do now or if we wait too long and we have some of these more extraordinary costs associated with mitigation. And as Joel said, we all pay for it, but I think this is where we sometimes get into that disproportionate impact where, for Salt Lake City anyway, we have completed studies on long-term water affordability. It's called a community financial capability study, a community's ability to pay for water. And just in the repair and replacement of aging infrastructure, we're seeing that by 2030, at our lowest quintile income earners in Salt Lake City, which also happen to be in closest proximity to the lake, are going to start exceeding the threshold of what is considered affordable basic water supplies. And so if we are adding on the cost of mitigation and we continue to wait and we have that much higher cost, I really worry about this environmental justice issue, not just on the air quality side that Amy was talking about, but also just basic access to water.
So you're feeling a sense of urgency, like let's not engineer some stuff now, let's fix this larger question.
I do feel a sense of urgency as a municipality that's close to the shore. I mean, we're not the only one. There's so many different jurisdictions, political jurisdictions in this basin, but I do feel a sense of urgency. I think it really is a question of public health, environmental health, and our ability to be economically sustainable as a community.
Steve, Clyde wasn't sure about the public trust doctrine, whether that would apply in the same way as the story from Mono Lake that you reported. What would it take to make the case that natural resources were of equal importance to water needs? What would that look like then? How would you do that? That doesn't seem to translate, at least from your point of view. So what would?
We are a desert state. Water is critically important to us. And so we have this absolute tension in society with the need to divert and use water to grow food, to have drinking water, sanitation, and these environmental protection needs. When all the water was divided up back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the environment was never part of the consideration. In fact, the water getting into Great Salt Lake was considered waste because that water was not being used. We did not have that understanding. Today we do. And I think we're seeing these new stakeholders come to the table, and we'll help force these issues. But it's a very difficult dynamic because we have so many people so dependent on diversionary rights. And we've got to, I think, take some incremental steps to get us to calm back and let some water go. But you've got to overcome 1 million acre feet of evaporative loss every year in the lake before you can get any net gain. And to do that and add another 1 million or so acre feet, that's going to be a Herculean task. And that's why I say this is a decades-long experiment to solve. But the health issues, I don't think, can last. We're already seeing a lot of respiratory health issues among children. I myself am a victim of it. I've been an athlete all my life. I have no genetic predisposition. I've developed emphysema. And I've done it from riding bicycles and running in Salt Lake City's filthy air for my entire life. If I do anything physical today, I need oxygen. And my doctors are convinced it is coming off the lake, and that is what's caused it. Now, are we going to infect the entirety of our society with respiratory illnesses? And can we stand that economic impact? So I agree with Laura, this isn't something we can ignore, but it can't be something you can implement overnight. It's not like building the Great Salt Lake pumping plants and have a one-time fix for a quick emergency. And this is going to take a long time to get to a resolution.
Leia and Amy Joy, you talked with a man named Jeffrey McKilkin of the Mono Lake Committee, who said it was important to think beyond just the body of water. What did he mean?
Well, he means that, in these saline lakes, they're kind of connected to the entire watershed. They're a direct reflection of what's going on in the entire watershed. So you can't just restore the lake itself. You really need to think, from the top of the mountains all the way to the bottom of the basin.
Yeah, and I would add to Steve's point is that the mitigation strategies that the Power Department put in place, the LA Department, they happened over decades, and it was a trial by error. They started out when they didn't even have best available control methods. And so what might work in one area, like managed vegetation, may not work in another area. They spent $3.6 million on, a quarter acre of gravel.
Yeah, it's very expensive.
And the gravel doesn't do anything for the birds. And so they went through a series of leaps and lurches, setbacks and steps forward to arrive at a system that basically did meet their end goal. But I think it'll be similar for us, where we try to find out the best strategic use of mitigation where it works best.
I guess what I'm trying to get at, though, is there was this legal declaration made. They asserted a public trust document. It's an old legal concept. Do we have the political, cultural will to, if it's impossible, Steve Clyde, to assert that, given the context of what we're talking about here, could we create something that makes that kind of statement? And Joel Ferry, do you think the idea of water getting to the lake being a waste, are those notions actually gone from this community now?
Yes. So that's it's your son. Okay. No. We'll swap mics here. I would just say that so the public trust doctrine is extremely complex, and it would basically blow up our entire water rights system. It would be very, very disruptive to what we're doing here in the state of Utah.
So forget that.
And as Steve said, it would take 100 years to adjudicate. It wouldn't be effective to solve our problem. So what is more effective? It's working to take on these challenges head on, to change. So number one, education. People of the state of Utah needed to understand what the problem was, and I think that they are grasping that. You look almost daily on the nightly news, we see articles in the newspapers. Like we have the collaborative, the Great GSL Collaborative. We have all of these efforts that are going on, so the people are now becoming educated, so they understand the problem. The legislature understands the problem. Last year, they invested hundreds of millions of dollars, nearly $500 million in water conservation, and we created in addition, we created a water trust to specifically go out and acquire water to bring to Great Salt Lake. Now, it was a start. We're not done. This year, we're looking at additional investment. I think we'll see investment just as significant as last year. We're going to continue to invest in our agriculture partners to help them optimize their water use. I can tell you, I'm absolutely amazed in our agriculture communities. When I go out into those communities, I talk to the people that are on the ground, farming, ranching, working the lands, using water. They want to do their part. They're asking, how can we help? How can I get, I have farmers asking me, how can I get my water down to Great Salt Lake so that someone in between doesn't take it? If I don't use it and it stays in the river, someone else is going to take it. I want my water to get to the lake. I literally had that conversation 2 weeks ago with a bunch of farmers out in West Weber. It was incredible. So people are changing, and I'm very encouraged by that. And I think that we look forward, we look at the options that are on the table, and we can make a significant difference today without having to go down these long legal paths and roads. But ultimately, it's going to take this concerted effort, and when we talk about who's going to pay for it and how are we going to get there, it's the people, and that's what I'm talking about. The state is making the investment. Incredible investment. And can I just say one other thing?
Sure.
To your point of has the policy, or has the do we recognize that water that goes to the lake is not wasted now? And I would say yes. We made significant strides last year with legislation that was run, specifically the in-stream flow bill that Steve referenced. That gave the ability of the Great Salt Lake to hold water rights. So Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, the Sovereign Lands is the organization within the state that manages the sovereign lands, which is Great Salt Lake. They can now specifically hold water rights and receive beneficial use to place water on Great Salt Lake. And that was a significant shift, a monumental shift in fundamental water law and policy in the state of Utah, and it passed overwhelmingly. And so we'll continue forward with those kind of efforts.
You seem really optimistic about this. No, please, yes.
Well, I kind of want to bring that down to what that monumental change of policy looks like on a local level. And Salt Lake City's done water supply and demand planning. Many water agencies do long-term water supply and demand planning. But in the past, that's really been water for beneficial uses for people in their taps and their land. And now I can look at my long-term water supply and demand planning and say, how can we do this to encourage water to go to Great Salt Lake? That's a really big change for a public water supplier and a water system in terms of how we can now look at water rights. And I'm experimenting with that now by applying that change in policy to the water rights associated with the treated effluent from Salt Lake City's sewer treatment plant. And if we're able to figure out how to apply that policy to that's a really big deal, and we can then replicate it in other ways.
I want to ask the reporters what they learned. Did you learn anything in California about dealing with what appears to be that divide between urban and rural communities in Utah? Where you have city dwellers who are worried about water being used to grow alfalfa. On the other hand, you have farmers who worry about people coming for their water rights, despite the optimism of Joel Ferry, and I get that, but there does seem to be that concern. I'm wondering, does that apply in California? What did you learn about that?
Yeah, I think for all the people we talked to, we didn't just talk to the city of Los Angeles and regulators and things. We were out in these towns trying to talk to people that just live there, just get their impressions and any advice they have for Utah. And you definitely got the sense that there's kind of this ambivalence toward the city of Los Angeles because they did kind of sneak into the Owens Valley and buy up all these water rights and change the fabric of their community, drained away all their water. So there's some bitterness, I would say, that remains from that. There's really no farming going on much at all there. It's just big open space, but they kind of like the open space too. And because Los Angeles is there mitigating the lake, they are a big source of jobs. So I think the sentiment is, it's a bit ambivalent.
And I recall one gentleman saying that they siphoned all the water to take it to LA. But it would be better, that was better than having LA come to them.
Yeah.
So, they didn't want to turn into an LA. So, he was pretty practical about it. I mean, I think there is some longstanding bitterness, but they didn't want to become LA and have the people move where the water is, which is so often the case in the West.
And I think too, sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
So, Manuel, I wanted to...
I was going to say, I think if I recall correctly, one of the people we talked to, I think his son actually worked for LA Water and Power. And so there is like that relationship that's kind of interesting there, because even while we were doing some of the interviews, LA Water and Power were actually like outside of the houses that we were doing these interviews, doing work over there. And so they're out there, and it's like you can see them everywhere. And so, they create jobs for a lot of people in those towns. I know that one of the people that we talked to as well, his kids moved away, and I think that's kind of what's happening a lot too over there is, the younger generation, they're moving away because of the dust. They didn't like growing up with it. So, and I think that's something that kind of sometimes happens here as well when it comes to like air pollution and things like that.
I remembered what I was going to say. So a point that we heard from a few people too is that had LA not come and bought up all the farmland and all the water rights, if it had stayed farmland, the lake probably would have dried up anyway, because that water, people were using it for farming. So that's something to think about too.
One of the takeaways from the reporting project, one of the key ones was you can't mitigate what you can't measure. Let's talk about that. Would mandating an elevation for Great Salt Lake, would that help?
We have, through the studies that have been done through forestry, fire, and state lands on a kind of sequential basis, have established optimum operating elevations, not a single one, but within this range. The lake operates best. It takes care of the environmental issues, the salt brine issues. And so we already have that data in hand. The question is, how do we get the water there to then reach those optimum levels?
Can you mandate that you get there?
Pardon?
Can you mandate that you get there? So you know the ideal number. Can you make it so? Sorry, everyone cannot use any more water. This is sounding incredibly dumb, but until we get to a certain level, can you mandate it? That's the question.
The governor has authority to do what he just did and close the entirety of the basin to new appropriations. That's one very positive step to stop any new water rights from being established. Doesn't deal with the old ones, but it does prevent new ones. Some states, particularly in the Northwest, have taken things a little further and have more or less mandated minimum stream flows and basically water rights for lakes. In the past, those have not been deemed a beneficial use, and water can only be appropriated for a beneficial use. But today, we understand the basis and the need to maintain these minimum flows. And we could go in and establish that we have to maintain X cubic feet per second of water flowing in these streams, and then work with individual water right owners who may be willing for an economic return to dedicate some water to that purpose. But I think it's going to take that. In the Northwest, they still have a lot of unappropriated water. We do not. Utah is essentially fully appropriated, so the only way to get a resource there is to acquire it from those who have it or steal it using the public trust doctrine.
Joel Ferry, does this assault your free market principles ideal? The idea of mandating something like this?
I think that we have to take into consideration what does that mean and how would that be implemented, because it's the same kind of concept. It's like a public trust light, right? Because you have, so if we say we have to have a minimum flow, well, who's going to pay for that minimum flow? Who's going to, not pay, but like pay in water, right? Well, which water are we going to take? Is it 5% from everybody? Is it, we start, like right now we have a prior appropriation system, and I would say that we have to look at those, first in time is first in line, right? Those older rights are the ones that receive the water first. And on a lot of other lakes, so Utah Lake, Bear Lake, some of these other larger sovereign bodies, there are settlements that exist on those lakes, right? The water that's available to be appropriated is only so much. We can't drain Bear Lake down to sand all the way down, right? There's a top layer that's used for people, and the rest is settled on and not available for appropriation. And same with Utah Lake. There's a certain level. Once the lake hits a certain level, certain diversions shut off. I mean, we saw that this year with secondary water coming off of Utah Lake going to the west side of Salt Lake County. Some of those systems had to be shut off because the lake got so low. And so we have to look at what is the right trigger mechanism, how can it be administered, and again, this is going, a lot of this is, I like to say we have, with the free market principles, we have a really, really good toolbox now. We have changed policies, we have laws in place, we're getting funding, we're doing these things. Sharp tools. We need to put them to work now. And so to jump right in and say, okay, we're going to go to this minimum lake level and we're going to shut everything off, it's a little bit premature, I think, right now, because we haven't implemented, we did this, for example, we funded the secondary water meter program last year, $250 million to the state. That funding just came available July 1. And so contracts are going out, work is being done now. We'll start to see those impacts here in the next 6 months to a year, 2 years. Same with ag optimization. We did $70 million. We did all these programs. We need to let some things play out a little bit before we jump off this cliff. But I think that certainly is discussion that's ongoing. And we have to recognize that this is it's taken us 40 years since the lake was, 35 years since the lake hit its peak back in the late 80s, 1987, 86, 87. It's taken us 40 years to get here. This is not something that, even if we shut off all diversions next year, the lake would not.
But Joel Ferry, one of the findings of the reporting was that there's not another 40 years to work this stuff out.
You're right, but I'm not saying it's going to take 40 years. But it will take some time. And so what we have to do is look at this long term. We have to have
how
a
much time
approach.
will it take? Because it's a very finite number that we're dealing with. The lake's already collapsing.
You're absolutely right, and that's why we're taking immediate action today to do things like, we're going to be making huge investment in cloud seeding. That's an immediate action that we can take to put more water into our systems.
I guess what I'm saying is that
we're doing these things, but you're right. We can't wait 40 years. I agree.
If you just rely on the natural inertia of the market, that won't grant you enough time. There's going to have to be an involvement of the government. That seems to be one of the lessons that came from the reporting project. There's a sense of urgency. Free market principles are great, and this does seem to be maybe one of the differences between the sort of political culture of California and Utah that you're going to have to contend with. I'm sorry.
Yeah, can I make a point about that? Is that okay? So you mentioned you can't mitigate what you can't measure, which is a mantra we heard over and over again, not just about the elevation, but also about the dust. So the reason we know Mono Lake is the largest source of human-caused dust pollution today is because there's a monitoring station out there, and a state agency pays for it. The reason we know it's not impacting the nearby community of Lee Vining is because there's a monitoring station there. So the Great Salt Lake, the bulk of the research has been done by some local university professors. That's how we know there's hot spots on the lake, but why aren't there fixed monitoring stations? Like, what communities are those impacting today? And maybe we need to implement some solutions to keep that dust down if it is impacting communities now while we wait for the water to rise. That's one of the
Manuel, you're showing us something?
What's that?
I was going to put up
Yeah.
Oh, good, yeah. Yes,
Doug, I just say, I think that same principle applies to actual water, water diversions and water distribution that we're managing as well. We can't manage the water properly without having the proper measurement on that water. And so that's one of those investments that we're making as well.
You guys want in on this?
Yeah, just briefly, Bear Lake presents a really interesting example. Because back in the 80s, there was a threat of a public trust lawsuit there by recreational owners of land around the lake who were upset that the water was being diverted, leaving them just hundreds of yards of open beach to get to actually open water. What happened there was the Pacific Corp that owned the storage reservoir, the big water users in the Utah and Idaho got together, and by agreement, they said, we are going to establish a minimum lake level that we're going to maintain, and each year we will forecast what the water supply is. That gives the farmers the ability to say, I can ratchet back my activity to meet the demand that I'm going to be able to meet with water available. And that has worked without a single lawsuit, without any issues whatsoever on the lake, because the parties came together and worked. Could that happen on Great Salt Lake? I think so. And that's what water banking, split season leasing, and these kind of tools we've put in place could do. The more draconian approach is to say, fine, government's got to step in. Rather than a public trust doctrine, we'll just target by condemnation, pick off water rights, pay for them, and move the water and create a water right for the lake. That can happen, but that's not very popular in Utah. Our politicians do not support that activity.
I think municipalities have a lot of great tools, and municipalities can mandate water restrictions. We do that through, water shortage contingency plans, through ordinance. And I'll say from my perspective, I get a lot of feedback from constituents pretty much every day that they want us to do something more. And sometimes what they want us to do more of is regulate. Now, sometimes that's because they see their neighbor overwatering and we want them to punish them. But I do think that municipalities hold a lot of cards in terms of being a big part of the collective action to solve the problem. And some of that is, land use, the link between land use, where cities and counties have land use authority, and water supplies for now and in the future. Smart growth is something we're talking about, integrated land and water planning. Senate Bill 110 last year talked about that. And so I do think that there are some softer regulatory tools that we can use that are pretty well supported, and it is an opportunity window for us right now too, frankly, because this has captured so much of the community's attention, unlike anything I've ever seen in 28 years of working in natural resources and environmental work. I also mentioned that the public, every single person in this basin is our most important partner. And the education and the acknowledgement of the issue is going to go really far in this situation, I think.
Let me come to another one of the key findings from the reporting project, and that is that everyone needs a seat at the table. Reporters, talk about what you heard in that way and how that came to be one of the key findings.
Well, again, I think a situation as dynamic as Great Salt Lake must necessarily involve a diverse group of stakeholders, like many of them who are already at the table. But if we're going to move even more aggressively or enact additional legislation, like Mr. Ferry said, we need even more voices at the table, and voices that you may not necessarily think are relevant. I remember Representative Chu talking about the public trust doctrine, the trust fund that was set up for the Great Salt Lake last session, and he had something quite heartfelt to say, because he's out by Jensen, and he's a cattle rancher out there, and he had a hard time selling that to his constituents. But eventually, with enough conversation, they realized, even though they're basins away, that this is not just the Great Salt Lake, this is our Great Salt Lake. So it takes educating the community as a whole, even those who don't live around its shores, even those who are impacted by the dust, but those who come to this realization that it's our Great Salt Lake. And I'd like to add to what I think Mr. Ferry said about planning, and I think it's Laura who said about planning, and cities have a large role to play. I was really surprised last session that there was successful legislation passed. And I keep forgetting his name, Representative Schultz. I should remember, he's my representative.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Yes.
That basically mandated that water conservation planning has to be part of a city or county's adopted master plan. And I think that even got some kickback from some political people up on the Hill. Could have been the Utah League, I don't know who else, but I was just like, duh? I mean, why hasn't this been going on? I mean, you see the house sprouting up like weeds and growth everywhere. And so why haven't cities been taking that into account when they're planning for growth in the future? But he did get it passed.
We're running out of time. I want to get to a few more things. I want to know, what are the hurdles or obstacles that still exist? What are the big ones? We don't have a lot of time to sort of work through it, but give me some basic. Reporters, do you want to start, or do you want these guys to start? Let them start. Steve, Clyde, what are the bigger obstacles that still exist that we need?
One of them is the problem is so Herculean in size that individuals are going to take the position that there's nothing I can individually do that will help anybody, so why should I give up my water right and my way of life and what I'm doing? And I think that mentality permeates a lot of the community. Laura, what do you think?
I think both a challenge and an opportunity is just identifying leadership. Leadership has to happen at every level in this basin, and we've seen—
So the obstacle is we lack leadership.
Lack of leadership
Okay.
on, I think on the state level there's been leadership, but you also need leadership in all of the other participating government jurisdictions too.
What do you think, Joel Ferry? What's an obstacle you're still worried about?
It kind of bleeds into both of those that the panel said, but it's right now one of the biggest obstacles is just coming up with enough funding to make a difference. This problem is so Herculean. These water rights are assets that are owned by someone or an entity, and that's not how our society works. We don't just go and take. And so how do we compensate properly, or how do we, mitigate properly? We're a relatively small state still. We have 3.5 million people. Our state budget's $23 billion. So for us to put $500 million into these efforts, that's an enormous component of our state budget when we have all these other concerns that are existing: transportation, education, et cetera. So finding ways we have ideas. We have, we have spent so much time looking at identifying the problem and being able to say, okay, this is how we solve the problem, but now how do we pay for it? So a component is to make sure that the people of Utah understand. We're doing education campaigns. We're going to be making big investment in education, but it's actually on the ground work that needs to be done today to make a difference. That's, I think, one of the biggest hurdles.
Is the political environment a hurdle? Hyper-partisan resistance on the right, for example, to regulation and those kinds of things, and maybe the excesses on the left are playing. Is that a problem you guys have?
So some components are still a hurdle, I would say. But when you look at so Representative Hawks from Centerville, he has a really neat presentation that he gives. That he talks about he served in the legislature for the last 8 years. In his first 6 years, they think they passed 2 or 3 bills that related to Great Salt Lake. And just this last year, he goes through and he has a list, and it's just a mile long, because this is one of the most important issues that we're facing. And so the political will is there. I think that people are coming around. It's still on the fringes. There's you get comments and different things that it's still it makes you wonder. But I think that we're so much further than we were 5 years ago. There's still more to do, but absolutely, it's the transition is happening.
What do you guys think? What are the obstacles you're still finding based on your journey?
To me, the biggest obstacle is that the lake needs water now. So Owens Lake is 100 square miles, and right now we have about 800 square miles of lakebed exposed. And the longer that sits exposed, the more of a health risk it poses. So.
I mean, I think the Great Salt Lake is literally the elephant in the room. And I think if I were to draw a comparison, you've got a bunch of people wearing blindfolds and they're always they're touching a different part of the elephant, and that's where they're coming from. So you have the industry perspective, you have the agricultural perspective, the advocacy perspective. So they're all seeing the elephant in a different way, and that's something to overcome, because they all want to take care of their own piece of the elephant.
I want to bring us back to the reporting project and the collaborative. Manuel, will you talk a little bit about the importance of creating visuals so people can see and put these things in context? Any of you want to talk about the importance of the collaborative in that sense? Visuals and reporting and finding stories and actual people who can tell these things. Because waterlogging is so arcane, it seems like who's going to be able to figure this stuff out?
Well, I think a big thing. I think a big thing is that hearing people's stories is like the best way to kind of have the most impact, and that's something I've been learning along my career. That I've been doing this for about 12 years now, and I know it may not seem that long compared to other photojournalists that have been doing it way longer than me. But I mean, me being a little bit younger has helped in the sense that I know people that I've grown up with, this is becoming like their number one thing that's top of mind. And because a lot of my friends are having kids. And so visually telling the story is really just showing how like the landscape is and really making sure that people get the idea of what's really going on there. So while I was there, I mean, me and Spencer Heaps, who was the photographer from Deseret News, we were literally out like 7 a.m. in the morning till dark every day, because there was so much out there to kind of show as what's going on over there. And so not only with the compelling interviews that we got over there, but I think the visuals were just as important too. And it was a treasure trove of just, there was beautiful things out there, and then there was things that were really stark and like not as awesome. And it was really kind of really eye-opening for me. So that's kind of why I made sure to get everything I possibly could. It's probably the most footage that I've ever filmed of any story I've ever been on in my life.
Wow. One of the questions you ask in the project is whether, and you're asking this of readers, does this reporting make you feel hopeful, concerned, inspired, surprised? So I wanted to ask you about that. Do you worry, and do you all worry? There's a lot too. It's scary as hell, this story. And so I wonder if there's this sense you worry about imposing this sense of utter hopelessness, because you would be forgiven for creating a doomsday scenario about all of this. And I'm wondering how you think about all of that. We've gotten that from guests. If you just talk about how bad this is, no one is going to care in the same way. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, I think that's the thrust of the Solutions Journalism Network, which is our ultimate sponsor of the collaborative. Is that we went down there not to just report on gloom and doom, but to find solutions and hope for the Great Salt Lake. And so I didn't walk away feeling like all is lost. I think, like Mr. Ferry said, that the legislature made great strides last year. I'm confident they'll make more strides this year. And I live on the shores of the Great Salt Lake in Upper Weber County, and I can see the changes that are playing out with wildlife and how it's affecting duck hunters and such. But I came away with some optimism that there seems to be the political will to get something done here.
I know, Doug, you've interviewed some people who were like, I'm a natural optimist, and I believe in people's ability to pull together and find solutions. And I would say I'm generally speaking not one of those people, but from this project, I think I did come back pretty hopeful. One big takeaway to me is that, again, everybody calls Owens Lake a dead lake, but the people who know it know that it never really died. And once they brought water back, the brine shrimp came back, the brine flies came back, and the birds came back. Now they have an annual bird festival, just like we do. So these systems are resilient. They can bounce back, but we can't be complacent with that in mind, because saline lakes are disappearing all around the world, and these are important ecosystems, and as they all decline, the birds and things are running out of places to go, so.
Coming away from the story, I did feel hopeful because at the very least, we kind of have somewhat of a playbook to go off of, and that's a better start than nothing at all. And so I think the biggest takeaway that I took from doing this was that sometimes the most simple solution is the best solution. Being at Owens Lake, I mean, they said that this, what is called tillage out there, ended up being kind of a farmer came up with the idea, and it ended up being their best solution to mitigate the dust. And it really shows that maybe that's kind of the solutions that maybe we could be looking for.
Final quick thoughts from the rest of you. What do you think about this question of being hopeful or optimistic, or how do you balance those things? Joel Ferry?
Yeah, I'll just tell you, I am very optimistic. What I'm seeing, what I'm working on, what we are working on at DNR, we will fix this problem. The people, the willpower, the political willpower is behind us. I think the willpower of the people is behind us. I was really encouraged. There was a poll that was done that showed that 70% of the people of Utah want us to make additional investment to save the lake. 80% are concerned. 70% want us to support it. And so it's there, and we will do whatever it takes to fix this problem, to save the lake. It's who we are. I mean, you know, the history of Utah is so incredible. Pioneers coming and settling in this hostile environment and building this beautiful place, and it's our job to take care of it. And this is part of that balance that we're trying to find, but I'm very optimistic about our future.
Thank you.
I agree with that, but I also want to acknowledge that this is a really hard and complicated issue, and it is going to take every single one of us rolling up our sleeves and working together on this. I'm optimistic that we've had a lot of bipartisan support in the state, and a lot of diversity in support. But we can't just look to someone else to get it done. We all have to take responsibility, and from what I've seen, I think people are willing to do that, and that makes me optimistic.
Let's give the water lawyer the last word.
I'm cautiously optimistic. And I am because we are seeing exponential growth in our population. All of those people need water to drink, food to eat, wastewater treatment, and development is occurring within areas of the state as if water were of no regard whatsoever. That panics me because the more we do and the more of the available limited water is soaked up with development, the less opportunity we have to deal with the lake. I'm encouraged by the legislatures embracing the problem. For a long time, they have not. The last 2 years have been eye-opening in terms of their efforts. Yeah. And so I really applaud leadership up there for what they've done. That gives me encouragement. But I see all these other issues out there. I see my next door neighbor who's got the luscious green lawn I could imagine, because his view is, my little contribution is minuscule, it means nothing. Why should I not enjoy my landscaping? And overcoming those issues are going to be very hard.
Thank you all very much for being with us. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good job. That's fantastic. Yeah. Thank you for the wastewater and your dedicating that. It's huge.